Hello. In this video, I want to continue discussing Colonialism as a System by Jean-Paul Sartre. The version of the essay that I have been discussing and will continue to discuss here is in Colonialism and Neocolonialism, this collection that has been translated by Routledge Press, that I believe was originally Situations 5 in French. So, in the last video, we discussed the setup of the colonial system as Sartre understands it, particularly the violent suppression of resistance to colonial rule following the invasion of Algeria in 1830, which involved, of course, the appropriation of land from Algerians and the transfer of that land to French colonials. That was facilitated in part through the violent repression of uprisings against colonial rule, but also through the imposition of a foreign legal system that parceled up land that was formerly held in common, handed it over in a conflicting way to indigenous peoples, and then leveraged the legal power of the French system to expropriate that land from them when disputes arose. Again, sometimes situations would arise where the same land was attributed to multiple people and they would bring claims up against each other and so on and so forth. So there was both a violent seizing of land and a legal framework foreign to Algeria that was imposed, which made it easy for French officials to claim land back. Now, once the land was transferred to the colonials, Sartre also mentions how the land ended up becoming concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, as is the way with capitalism. Fewer people end up with larger control over the market. That he discusses. Here he says, the colonial system is in place. The French state gives Arab land to the colonists in order to create for them a purchasing power which allows French industrialists to sell them their products. The colonists sell the fruits of this stolen land in the markets of France. Just above that, he had said, in short, it has taken just a century to dispossess them of 2/3 of their land, dispossess the Arabs of 2/3 of their land. Today, 6,000 landowners have a gross agricultural revenue of more than 12 million francs. Some of them reach 1,000 million or a billion. From that point on, then, he goes on, the system feeds itself, it runs smoothly, and we shall follow all its consequences to see it become more and more rigorous. So, it's important, again, to recognize that in order to have a market in the colony, one had to be created, and that was one of the functions of the expropriation of land, to generate a class of people who were French citizens. Remember, the idea of the imperial colonialism is to enrich France, so you cannot enrich the indigenous people or non-French citizens in the colony. You have to create a French market in the colony to continue to enrich France. So you take the land from the Arabs, you give it over to the colonists. So the colonists exploit the land for materials that are sent to France to produce goods, which are then sent back and resold to the market generated by the colonial expropriation of land and the handing over of such land to French industrialists. So this destroys, of course, the traditional arrangements. We've already discussed that the communal land is broken up and privatized and enclosed and so on. In Frenchifying and dividing up the property, the structure of the old tribal society was broken without putting anything in its place. The destruction of the framework was systematically encouraged, first because it suppressed the forces of resistance and replaced collective strength with a handful of individuals, next because it created labor, at least as long as farming was not mechanized. This labor force alone offsets the transport cost, it alone maintains the profit margins of the colonial companies in the face of economies in France where production costs keep going down. Thus, colonization has turned the Algerian population into an immense agricultural proletariat. It has been said of the Algerians that they are the same men as in 1830 and work the same land, only instead of owning it, they are the slaves of those who own it. So the colonized are not fully brought into the fold of French citizenship and nationality. So on the one hand, they become governed by the laws of France, and those laws are leveraged against them in order to expropriate their land, but they're not really part of the system except as laborers that get exploited now. They used to work land that was theirs. That land is now gone. They can still work the land, but they do so for the profit of the new owners under French rule. So again, the idea that somehow bringing civilization is some kind of great benefit is false and unworkable under the colonial model. The whole system, that's the point of, again, colonialism is a system, needs to be reworked if anything is going to benefit the people who have been marginalized and excluded from the largesse of society, and so on. Now, second, so first, the structure of the old tribal society is broken. The collective entities that held land in common are broken up along with the land into discrete individuals that again can be pitted against each other in their discrete roles within the French legal system. So second, if at least the initial theft was not of the colonial type, it could perhaps be hoped that mechanized agricultural production would allow the Algerians themselves to buy the produce of their land more cheaply. But the Algerians are not, nor can they be, the colonist customers. The colonist must export to pay for his imports. He produces for the French market. The logic of the system makes him sacrifice the needs of the native population to those of the French and France. And his example here is wine growing. So the colonized people aren't the ones who are benefiting from the production of the French colony. The colony, the land that has been appropriated, used to be used to serve the needs of native Algerians, of the Arabs that lived there. They grew food on it and so on. Well, whenever that is seized and handed over to the colonists are now producing according to the demands of the French market back in France. So they grow wine and stuff on it. What used to be used to grow food, grains and so on and so forth, is now being used to grow wine for the French market, and then wine will come back to Algeria for the consumption by the colonists. Between 1927 and 32, wine growing increased by 173,000 hectares, more than half of which was taken from the Muslims. However, Muslims do not drink wine. I mean, that's the irony of the wine example, is of course that Islam forbids wine drinking, and so there's a large population, of course not everybody, but a large percentage of the indigenous population don't imbibe wine. So their land has been taken and made to used to produce a product that they wouldn't even enjoy if they were able to. Again, the whole market is directed toward the needs of France, which is a big wine drinking, population, right? 500,000 hectares were taken from the best land and entirely devoted to wine growing, were reduced to unproductiveness and as good as wiped out for the Muslim masses from their perspective. So the production of cereals retreats southward. The land there isn't quite as good because it's on the edge of the desert. As it retreats southward, it's getting closer and closer to the desert climate. It's Saharan desert territory as it goes down south. So, of course, France is the sole benefactor. It gets the best land to grow produce for its population. The land is pushed to the margins. Land for the Arab Muslim use is pushed to the margins, so literally marginalized in a way, and they are forced into bare subsistence. The result has been a continual deterioration of the situation. The growing of cereals has not increased for 70 years. During this time, the Algerian population has trebled. And if we want to count this high birth rate among the benefits from France, let us remember that it is the poorest population that have the highest birth rates. And here he gives a sort of official figures for how much grain is grown for each inhabitant. 500 kilos in 1871, down to 400 in 1901, down to 250 in 1940, finally at 200 kilos in 45. So you have that cut in half over the course of 1871 to 1945, right? So at the same time, the effect of the shrinking of individual properties was to remove the livestock, roots, and toll rates. In the pre-Saharan South, to which the Muslim cattle and farmers are restricted, livestock is more or less stable. In the North, it has disappeared. So again, you go from before in 1914, 9 million head of livestock, in 1950, only 4 million. And the agricultural production, again, Muslims producing 48 billion francs worth, with Europeans producing 92 billion francs worth. So 9 million men provide 1/3 of the agricultural produce, and let's not forget that only this third can be consumed by them, and the rest goes to France. Again, so they're being left with fractions of what they produce. All production has been reoriented to enrich France, not just in terms of the wealth that's produced from it, but also the kinds of, like the wine example, the kinds of products that get generated in Algeria. So the whole system is transformed relative to the needs of the nation of France, which completely overshadows and literally marginalizes the needs of the native population, who's being exploited for the colony's profit in that sense. So again, the irony of this gift of the legal system and so on and so forth, with that, which disadvantages and is not designed to advantage or include the native population, which is subject to its rule, though not empowered by it, right? So again, it's impossible for families to limit their spending. Food takes up all their money. There's nothing left for clothing, housing. So reduced to sort of bare minimal income. So we're having rates of extreme poverty. And the only reason for this increasing pauperization is that the wonderful colonial agriculture has settled like a canker at the very heart of the country and eats away at everything. Okay, so we moved first. Tribal society is broken without any replacement for it, for those individual people who are in the population, and they become subject to a law that is not to their advantage and doesn't have their interest in mind, because again, it's oriented around the French national interest. Then they're not able to buy the produce, which is not even designed with them in mind. So the production is oriented around the needs of a foreign market, and not only can native people not afford it, but some of the things it produces are irrelevant to them. Again, the wine example, so on and so forth. You can see they're not the customers. I mean, they're not the market was created in the colony by French colonists, and so not only can they're not the intended market, they can't afford it, and so on. The market for these goods has been created by the French, government. The colonists are the market, not the colonized. And then the concentration of the ownership of the land, as it accrues gradually to a few French owners, facilitates mechanization. So you get industrial agriculture. Now the Arabs are out of a job. So we had said before that, well, you had the same people working the same land, only they didn't own it anymore, and they were producing crops that were not suited to their needs. But now, once the land becomes increasingly concentrated in fewer French hands, and agriculture becomes mechanized and industrialized, now the people don't even have a job working the land. So, mainland France is delighted to sell tractors to the colonists, while the productivity of the Muslims, restricted to the poor land, has fallen by a fifth. That of the colonists increases day by day for their profit alone. Vineyards of 1 to 3 hectares, the modernization of growing methods is difficult or even impossible, produce 44 hectoliters per hectare. Vineyards of more than 1,000 hectares produce 60 hectoliters per hectare. Again, there you have the technology-driven unemployment. Agricultural laborers are replaced by machines. Now, what would happen in rural societies if agriculture is taken over by mechanization and workers are driven out by machines? The agricultural workers shift to industrial work and move to cities. This has been a trend throughout industrialization. You have migration from rural areas to urban centers where there's industrial work to be done. But France doesn't allow the colony industrial work. The colony produces raw materials that are sent to France, and the industrial centers are in France where things are produced. So there's nowhere for the rural agricultural workers to go. The usual path for them when an industry like agriculture is industrialized is gone, because there aren't industrial centers. There's just sites of production of raw material, which again are being increasingly mechanized, right? That's what he says. The unemployed flock to the towns where they are occupied for a few days doing public works, and then they stay there for want of knowing where else to go. This desperate underclass increases year after year. In 1953, there were just 143,000 salaried employees officially registered as having worked for more than 90 days, that is to say, 1 day in 4. Nothing demonstrates better than the increasing rigor of the colonial system. You begin by occupying the country, then you take the land and exploit the former owners at starvation rates. Then, with mechanization, this cheap labor is still too expensive. You finish up taking from the natives their very right to work. All that is left for the Algerians to do in their own land at a time of great prosperity is to die of starvation. You can read Camus did a lot of reporting for newspapers in Algeria in the 1930s, and in Algerian chronicles there is collected there some of Camus' writing on the famine in Algeria, and he writes in great detail about the conditions that Sartre is describing at a little bit greater distance here. So you can sort of see with amongst this group of thinkers there's this interest in the situation in Algeria and a concern for the conditions that colonialism is generating for the people who live under it, the native Arab population and indigenous population of North Africa that is subject to this colonial rule. So one of the things that they can do is go to France. And of course, they meet resistance going to France. Same thing that we see in the United States with immigration. They're coming here and taking our jobs. They're doing this, that, and the other. There's a lot of anti-Algerian, anti-Arab racism in France that causes tension when. Because if there's no industrial centers in Algeria, and the usual route is to move from being an agricultural worker to an industrial one in a city, there's no industrial centers in Algeria, but there are industrial centers in France. And France is the one who is setting up this situation, whose laws that you're subject to. So naturally, if you're looking for work, you think about going to France and working in an industrial center and sending money back home, which he discusses here. Do those here in France who dare to complain that Algerians take the jobs of French workers know that 80% of them send half of their wages to their family, and that 1.5 million people who have remained in the douars live exclusively on the money sent to them by these 400,000 voluntary exiles? And this is also an inescapable consequence of the system. The Algerians are obliged to seek in France the jobs that France denies them in Algeria. For 90% of Algerians, colonial exploitation is methodical and rigorous. Expelled from their lands, restricted to unproductive soil, obliged to work for derisory wages, The fear of unemployment discourages their revolts. Strikers fear that blacklegs might be recruited from among the unemployed. As a result, the colonist is king. He grants none of the things that pressures from the masses has managed to extract from the bosses in France. No wage indexation, no collective agreements, no family allowances, no canteens, no workers' housing. 4 walls of dried mud, some bread, some figs, 10 hours of work a day. Here the wages are plainly the minimum necessary to recuperate the strength to work. That is the picture. So the violent uprising of the Algerians against the France, in Sartre's eyes, is in part justified because of the desperate situation, the corner that they've gotten backed into here. Which, from the account given in Colonialism as a System, and also, again, the reporting that Camus does in the Algerian Chronicles, the reporting of from the Algerians' own mouths at this time, is dire, and reforms within the system are not going to change the situation. The system is designed to enrich France and provide a French market for French-produced goods in Algeria. Without drastically altering the very structure of that system, it's just not going to work. That's how Sartre sees it. And that's why he finds, ultimately, many of the arguments that we'll see in Fanon to be compelling. Right? The next point, of course, is that there's supposed to be this philanthropic, we give them culture. As for our famous culture, who knows whether the Algerians were very keen to acquire it, but what is certain is that we denied it to them. So they weren't as bad as the United States, which actually made it illegal to teach slaves to read and so on and so forth. But illiteracy among Algerians is at 80%. Sartre reports here. It would not be so bad if we had just forbidden them the use of our language, of France, but a necessary aspect of the colonial system is that it attempts to bar the colonized people from the road of history, as nationalist claims in Europe have always been founded on linguistic unity. The formation of nations in Europe was often driven by identifying the nation with a language group. So German-speaking people coalesce into Germany. The different German-speaking kingdoms, Swabia, Prussia, so on, get united into Germany, and the language becomes very important. Same with France, Italy, and so on. The linguistic element of national pride and culture coalescing around a language group and unifying it into a nation-state is very important within Europe. But the Muslims were denied use of their own language. So it's not just that they're barred from learning French, but they are barred from using their own language. Since 1830, the Arabic language has been considered as a foreign language in Algeria, again, because as a French colony, the official language is French. French administration confiscated their religion. So there's this cultural assault. I mean, that's what this section is really about. So it's not only the material conditions, the land, the way the land is used to make consumer goods, but also the very culture then is under attack. The idea of the colony is that there's a French culture there, but again, the Arab population is excluded from that. In a word, it fabricates natives by a double movement which separates them from their archaic community by giving them or maintaining in them, in the solitude of liberal individualism, a mentality whose archaism can only be perpetuated in relation to the archaism of the society. It creates masses, but prevents them from becoming a conscious proletariat by mystifying them with a caricature of their own ideology. So this whole individualism is a Western invention that is foreign to the cultural Arab population, that separates them from one another and prevents them from unifying or coalescing together in a front that can provide opposition to the colony, the colonizers. And so it tries to instill them a sense of individual pride in their ancestral heritage, but that ends up being a caricature because essential elements of that cultural heritage have been denied. And so they end up basically being fed a westernized caricature of their culture. That is what is sort of permitted to them within the confines of the structural framework of the colony. And it's to the advantage, again, I mean, it's to the advantage of the colonizer to do this, because by fragmenting people in this way and denying them the basis of solidarity, it can weaken them and cut off opposition before it crops up, or at least before it gets too strong, right? The next part moves into why then these reforms don't work. Let's suppose that mainland France proposes a reform. There's three possible scenarios. One, the reform turns automatically to the advantage of the colonists and the colonists alone. We've already seen this heavily foreshadowed, right? To increase the yield of the land, dams and a whole irrigation system were constructed, but as you know, water can only feed the land in the valleys. Now these lands have always been the best of Algeria. The Europeans have taken them over, so and so on and so on, right? So reforms always benefit the colonizer because, again, as a system, the system is designed to benefit and enrich France, right? So any reform within the system is going to be a reform that serves the end that has been set ahead of time of enriching France. Second, it is denatured in such a way that it is rendered ineffective. A reform that improves the lot of the native population is dangerous because if their lot is improved, they become a political force. They are integrated better into society and can start making demands. So the reform has to be denatured so that it's rendered ineffective, because if it's effective, it will improve their lot and increase their status in society such that they could leverage that newfound political clout against the colony. So the reform has to be defanged. It has to be made so that it can't bite back. Third, it is left dormant with the complicity of the administration. The provision of the Martin Law in compensation for the added value given to their land by irrigation was that the colonists would cede some parcels of land to the state. The state would have sold these parcels to Algerians who would have been allowed 25 years to pay off their debts. So you see, it was a modest reform. It was quite simply of questioning the question of selling back to a few chosen natives a tiny part of the land that had been stolen from their parents. The colonists would not lose a penny. But for them it is not about losing. They must always get more. Accustomed for 100 years to the sacrifices that mainland France has made for them, they could not accept that such sacrifices might benefit the natives. The result, the Martin Law was put on ice. So you get a reform passed, but it's not actually put into effect. Which again, I mean, I think the example of this Martin Law that he uses is already kind of... you loan them money to buy back a little bit of land that they can then pay off, but I mean, it's kind of already like, it seems like a little offensive. Well, you took all of our land and now you're going to let me buy back a little bit of it from you? Great, for a modest profit, right? And so on. So the reforms are ineffective. They cost a lot, they're too expensive for mainland France, and the colonizers in Algeria have neither the means nor the will to finance them. And he goes into the cost of how much education would cost and so on, right? The colonial system is not just an abstraction then for Sartre. It's an organization of the material conditions in the colony that is geared toward the enrichment of France. The system exists, it functions, the infernal cycle of colonialism is a reality, but this reality is embodied in a million colonists, children and grandchildren of colonists who have been shaped by the colonialism and who think, speak, and act according to the very principles of the colonial system. For the colonist is fabricated like the native, he is made by his function and his interest. Linked to the mainland by the colonial pact, he has come to market for France, in exchange for a fat profit, the goods of the colonized country. He has even created new crops which reflect the needs of France more than those of the natives, and so on. And this is going to cause, again, a huge rift between Sartre and someone like Camus. Remember, as a Pied Noir, as a French national born in Algeria, Camus feels the very thing that Sartre is pointing out here. Camus, or someone like Camus, feels that Algeria is his home, is his homeland. He was born there. Sartre does not hold such claims to be legitimate. No, you're a foreign entity on Algerian soil, and you are exploiting Algeria for the benefit of France without really giving the native population any sort of benefit to that, right? So the Pied Noirs are fabricated. The colonizer is fabricated for, again, in the creation of that market, for the benefit of France. That category of person didn't exist prior to the invention of the colonial system. It was a function designed within the system that someone could step into in order to produce profit and wealth back to France, right? So we're not talking about like the creation of a human being in their body and consciousness or anything like that. We're talking about the creation of a kind of person who fulfills a social function. It's more the creation of a function within a system that then the individual with the body and consciousness and everything is able to step into and fulfill the social function. Now again, we're moving between perspectives here. We're looking at it from the outside of the individual consciousness. And so we're looking at it from a position in which that person is objectified within the social role that they play. We can always switch back and consider them from the perspective of their freedom, but from that perspective they have a choice to make about how they're going to relate to the social situation and the role that they're being asked to perform. And they can choose it and fulfill that function, or not. Try and do something else, resist it, and so on and so forth. But from the outside, from the systematic perspective, it's always the individual is going to appear as an object within the system fulfilling a function. That's just the nature of the theoretical position outside of the given consciousness. But from within the system and from within the first personal perspective, the person must make a decision about how they're going to relate to that social function and role that they're being asked to fulfill. And we can see in the writings of Camus and in Sartre and Beauvoir and Fanon, and it's an agonizing choice to have to make, especially when you're being faced with violence. First, the violence of the colonizers against the native population, and then the violence of the native population and its uprising against foreign rule. Right? So it's not a decision to be made lightly. But again, we're being asked to navigate and move back and forth between these different positions. You can see that at this stage, the intellectual friendship between these existential thinkers, Sartre, Beauvoir, Camus, had cooled. They had broken off with one another. There was a very public row between them all. And you can see this kind of paragraph here on page 51 is very biting from Sartre against someone of Camus' status. The colons, whose interests are directly contrary to those of the Algerians and who can base exploitation only upon pure and simple oppression, can accept these rights for himself to enjoy only in France among the French. To this extent he detests the token universality of French institutions. Precisely because they apply to everyone, the Algerians could claim these rights. One of the functions of racism is to compensate the latent universalism, the bourgeois liberalism. Since all human beings have the same rights, the Algerians will be made subhuman. This is always the role of racism. If we profess a universal liberal politics, then that has to extend to everyone. But because of the system of colonialism, some people are just by the arrangement of the system excluded from that universal vision. If we really owned up to the universal principles, the system would be destroyed, And so we create a category of race in order to exclude people from the system so that the system can go on and we can still pretend to our universal ideals. So a little dig at the universalism of liberal ideals there, and how that functions ideologically within the system of because again, a true commitment to extend universal rights to all people would destroy the system of colonialism, because you would have to include then the Algerians and consider their rights. Racism alleviates us with that from that burden, because then we can assert that the Algerians are not people and therefore not entitled to the universal rights that are lauded by liberalism. Same in the United States with racism. The compromises that may count Africans as less than whole persons, and all of this, kind of stuff. The whole doctrine of white supremacy espoused by the Confederate States and their Articles of Secession, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is standard oppressive tactic of oppressor, dehumanization, and in order to exclude them from categories of legal rights that are professed to be universal, and so on. This creates a contradiction. And here is where we see Sartre looking at colonialism as destroying itself, right? And we are witnessing, according to Sartre, in the Algerian Revolution, the fruit of this contradiction coming out and trying to resolve itself. And you also see Sartre leaning a bit into that Marxist understanding of the dialectic of history, where you get a contradiction that emerges that needs to resolve the tension within society, and a synthesis of that contradiction in a certain way. Now, Sartre is going to tweak that a little bit, and he becomes almost obsessed with this question. I mean, the Critique of Dialectical Reason, this robust attempt, I mean, whether or not it's successful is a debate for a whole other series of videos and is going on. There's just a recent interesting article, I think, in the Boston Review about Marxism and existentialism. But Sartre spills a lot of ink trying to reconcile existentialism with Marxism. And again, that's mostly in the Critique of Dialectical Reason. Okay, so this has been Sartre's understanding of colonialism as a system. I'm going to leave this essay here. I think you can see again the kind of passion and vitriol that these thinkers have for colonialism as a system. I think some of that extends from the guilt that they feel for their roles in such a system and their attempts to change it. Next, I'm going to turn and look at Sartre's preface to The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, and then we will look at Fanon's work, Black Skin, White Masks. Okay. Thank you for joining me in this video, and I will see you in the next one.